Welcome to Aim High Live. I'm your host and CEO, Jim Park. Today we are honored to have Dave Liu, CEO of Lucrative Endeavors, on our program. Dave recently published a book entitled The Way of the Wall Street Warrior, which chronicles his journey to upper management and provides real-world strategies for getting ahead in our industry. Previously, Dave was a co-head of digital media and internet investment banking group at Jefferies and was also an entrepreneur who has started multiple companies. In this episode, Dave provides a practical, no-nonsense advice on what it took to advance in his career.
Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to David, and then we'll take some questions after his talk. So, David.
Okay, thanks so much, York, for having me on. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to share some of what I've learned over my career and also share some ideas with this community. I'm going to start off today by walking through a brief presentation. But essentially, as York mentioned, my name is Dave Liu. I've been a 30-year veteran on Wall Street and Silicon Valley. I'm going to cover today one chapter in a career book I wrote called The Way of the Wall Street Warrior. And in it, I cover one core principle that has helped me in my career, and that is always be a stork. Some of you may be familiar with the fables of storks, which have been associated with babies for centuries. Danish author Hans Christian Andersen popularized the fable in The Storks, a short story he wrote in which storks pluck babies from a pond and deliver them to families of good children. And so I use it as a metaphor for always delivering value, always delivering the baby. And by having this attitude and mindset, I've found that this has been a great North Star for my career and has never steered me wrong. But before we jump into tactics on how to be a stork, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I've had a long career. Starting on the left here, I worked on Wall Street for almost 25 years, climbing the corporate ladder from the entry-level janitor suite to the executive suite, where I was a managing director and co-head of the internet and digital media group at Jefferies before the age of 33. During that time, I worked with hundreds of companies, completed IPOs, M&A deals, and a variety of different transactions with top tech companies like Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, to name a few. And during that time, I mentored hundreds of bankers, many of whom were Asian American. I'm glad to say many of them have gone on to many of the top business schools like Harvard and Wharton, and many have become CEOs, managing directors, and successful corporate execs. Going down the left column, I also started a merchant banking firm where I made several investments, and many of them have become multi-billion-dollar unicorns. I love movies, and one of my favorites is The Godfather. In it, Marlon Brando is the Godfather, and he has a right-hand man named Tom Hagen, who is his consigliere. And for all of my companies, I am the CEO or founder's Tom Hagen. So I not only invest in these companies, but I also give them advice on everything from financing, strategy, HR, and sometimes I'm even their therapist. I've also been an entrepreneur myself. In total, I've founded 4 companies in technology, media, asset management, merchant banking, and one of them reached over 1,000 employees. And for each of these companies, I took them essentially from a concept, a PowerPoint, to an established enterprise. On the right, as York had mentioned, you'll see that I'm not just a corporate wonk. I'm a creator. I love to write and draw. I have a cartoon series called The ABC Life about an Asian American family. And I wrote a book called The Way of the Wall Street Warrior, which was published by Wiley on November 9th and has all of my career tactics. I'm also a big believer in giving back and supporting charities like Smile Train that repairs clefts in babies, as well as serve on the executive board of my undergraduate program at the University of Pennsylvania. And I also serve on the Trust Advisory Committee, helping to manage the endowment of the National Engineering Honor Society, Tau Beta Pi. In terms of my corporate career, here's a little more detail. I joined Jefferies when it was really a fledgling investment bank in 1993. It had fewer than 200 employees and just under 20 bankers. I was at the time, and I think still even to this day, I was the youngest hire in the firm's history. I was hired at 20 years old, and I became an associate in 18 months. And I went to Harvard Business School, and then I moved to Silicon Valley to help build the firm's technology practice. I became a managing director and co-head when I was 33 and was one of the youngest MDs and one of the few people of color at that level at the firm. I was an MD for almost a decade, and then I retired after almost 25 years at the firm. In all, I was among the top 1% of the longest tenured members of the firm, which now has about 3,000 employees and about a market cap over 10 billion. Diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI, is a big buzzword today, particularly on Wall Street. But frankly, Wall Street is still largely a white man's world. In 2021, more than 80% of the executive levels still consists of white men. This is even the case at the more progressive firms like a Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley. And this is frankly despite the fact that Asian Americans are actually overrepresented at the entry and junior level. But what I've seen is many leave or flame out by middle management. So the data shows that there's clearly a bamboo ceiling on Wall Street. So my goal today is to share a little bit of wisdom from my career. As I said earlier, I love film, especially The Matrix. In the movie, the main star, Neo, is given the option to take a red pill, which will open up his mind to a new reality, a new way of thinking. And that's also my goal with today's discussion and also with my book. I fundamentally believe that the world isn't fair and that the corporate game is exactly that, a game where the rules are fluid and working hard and keeping your head down can actually be a recipe for disaster. It can be a one-way trip to an unfulfilling career, or even worse, ejection at middle management. I also went to two of the top business schools in the world. I've had multiple HR training and leadership training, and I can say for myself definitively that I didn't really learn much of practical value. Everything I learned to get ahead and climb the ladder was really taught to me in the School of Hard Knocks and largely through trial and error. So hopefully by sharing some of my tips, I can save you a little bit of pain and suffering if you're still working your way up that corporate ladder. So I've often been asked, so what's your secret? Well, I'll say, much like everything in life, there's no one silver bullet. Because if I had it, I'd be a trillionaire, because then I just bottle it up and sell it. But if I were forced to distill what is the essence of how I was able to break through the bamboo ceiling, I'd say it's really a combination of two key things. One is I worked hard, really hard, like 80 to 120 hours a week for 25 years hard. And I made sure I was always one of the first in the office, one of the last to leave, and I focused on being one of the most productive people at the firm. The second is really, really understanding what makes people tick, understanding what their motivations are, and then building incentives and strategies around it. What you'll see with a lot of these books here on the right is that for more than 50 years, there's actually been a ton of research into fields like cognitive science, or essentially the study of how people think. And what it's revealed is that people are fundamentally irrational, that they aren't motivated by the obvious. But once you understand what people are motivated by, then you can figure out how to have them help you. And that's essentially what I've done throughout my entire career. So in summary, for me, it's really been a combination of one, hard work, and then two, understanding how to incent people to do what I need them to do for me. So with this backdrop, let me give you that one key principle that's driven me throughout my career. And it's really quite simple. It is always, always add value. If you aren't adding value, then you're in the way. You're overhead. You're replaceable. Now, I know that some of you are probably thinking, okay, man, that's obvious. I agree, okay? But I can tell you from 30 years of corporate experience, the vast majority of people don't actually do this. In fact, they do the opposite. Rather than being storks who deliver the baby, who deliver solutions, they're pigeons. Pigeons do the opposite. So they fly in, they crap on everything, and then they take off. I've been in thousands of meetings in my life, and 99% of them are like this. Someone is presenting an idea, a strategy, a product, a way forward for the company. And the vast majority of people either say nothing, particularly the junior people, or they think they add value and demonstrate how smart they are by pointing out all the problems in the plan, all the reasons why, that deal won't work or that investment's a bad investment. And they say this doesn't work or that doesn't work. And then inevitably what happens is time runs out and they take off. They're pigeons. And you know what happens to pigeons? Well, if they aren't the boss, then they don't ingratiate themselves to anyone. In fact, they become the people organizations think aren't bringing real value and are the ones they think about first when considering who to replace, who to not promote. So why do so many people do this? Well, it's because it's much easier than coming up with solutions. Backseat driving is easy. Front wheel steering is hard. And I'll tell you as a sidebar, many of my friends run top investment firms. And one of the senior partners at one of the top firms in the world told me once that he got really frustrated by a lot of his junior professionals. And one time he felt that he had to yell at one of them. And what he yelled at that person was the following. He basically said, look, I don't pay you to say no. I pay you to say yes. And so that's just a small microcosm of essentially what I'm saying, which is add value. So if you really want to stick out from the crowd, you want to be a stork. Always bring value, especially when you're junior. When you're more senior, you can be a little bit more like a pigeon, but that only works once you're the boss and people have to listen to you. So bottom line, if you want to get ahead, be a stork, not a pigeon. As a cautionary tale, I actually learned this really early in my career. I was 19 when I worked at Goldman Sachs. I was this hot shot punk summer intern who thought I was smarter than everybody else. Essentially, I had the curse of knowledge, like the character Sheldon Cooper from the show Big Bang Theory. And in short, I was a jerk. So being the precocious smartass that I was in a meeting one time with my boss and several other senior people. My boss was making a presentation of a plan, and he got one fact wrong. And so I felt compelled to correct him on this point because I thought that's how I would add value. I was a pigeon. Now, little did I know that his boss was actually in the meeting. So when I made my point, my boss glared at me like I killed his firstborn. So needless to say, he never invited me again to another meeting for the rest of the summer, which taught me a very important lesson. No one likes a know-it-all, especially one who just points out all your mistakes. So I had this foot and mouth disease for a few more years, but gradually I learned how to be a stork and not a pigeon. And now to this day, if I point out any issues, any problems, I always try to come up with a solution. And I found this to be a winning formula. It's one where people actually welcome your participation and welcome your input and not shy away from it. So now you're probably wondering, what are some tactical ideas? Well, since I'm a stork, I'll give you a few to think about. But first, let's start with some science. So being grounded in cognitive bias is really helpful when figuring out what motivates people and what makes them get to do what you want them to do. So for the eager beavers among you, you can actually look up a list of cognitive biases in Wikipedia. There are literally hundreds of them now after decades of research. But here are a few of my favorites. The first is attentional bias. This essentially is a fancy term for the fact that no one reads or listens to anything anymore. The bottom line is we all have the attention span shorter than a goldfish. Second is the paradox of choice. This one refers to the fact that people really don't want more choice. They want less because making decisions is actually painful. Making one decision means cutting off others, and we all suffer from regret when we make the wrong decision or feel like we've made the wrong choice. So it's kind of like the last time, you might have gone to a buffet and loaded up on main courses and you didn't leave room for dessert. I don't know about you, but that always frustrates me. Third is prospect theory. So the Nobel Prize was actually awarded for this one, which determined that we are all fundamentally risk averse. We hate losing a lot more than we love winning. And it reminds me of the saying that life needs to win every day, but death only needs to win once. And that's frankly why we're constantly protecting our downside. And then last but not least is self-interest. Largely due to evolutionary biology, we're all out for ourselves. It took me a long time to realize this in my career, But one of my close friends who runs one of the top VC firms in the world said it correctly when he said this to me. He said, look, others aren't necessarily out to get you. They're just out for themselves. So figuring out how to help others is an easy way to make them help you. So those are my baseline ideas for this presentation. They're the ones I often think about when I'm strategizing on how I can add value. Now, one of my strong beliefs is that no one can ever walk in another person's shoes. So for instance, as a man, I'll never know what it's like to be a woman. So I can't advise women in the audience on what to do. But what I can certainly share with you is what I did. And maybe some of these will work for you. So first, in my career, I noticed that almost any job can be broken down into projects. And when you look at things on a project level, I quickly realized that they all share the same challenge around getting people's attention and overcoming the attentional bias that I talked about earlier. So I focus on how to address what I call goldfishitis. So first, I always think about how to maximize mine and others' return on time invested, or ROTI, as I call it. So for the time and effort that I have to invest in something or someone, like in understanding, say, my memo, a pitch, a project, an investment thesis, is the reward sufficiently compelling? Will they look back on our interaction and say to themselves, hey, man, that was a good use of time? Or will they say, man, I wish I could get my hour back? One of the ways I brought immediate value was I made smart cuts for myself and templatized everything. In my career, I prepare and reuse a lot of the same material. So what I did was I learned to create standard templates for everything: financial models, investment memos, presentations. And by creating templates and standards for all this, I saved myself a ton of time and maximized my personal ROTI. But it also maximized the ROTI of my boss and my clients. They would quickly see the answer because I'd iterate my templates so much that the answer was obvious. The format would be largely similar and simple and easy to find the answer. And my bosses didn't really realize it in the moment, but essentially I was training them to get the best use of their time and maximize their ROTI by giving them the answer. Another thing I did as a junior person was I always got to the point right away. I realized that whenever I was delivering work, it wasn't a movie. Nobody, in a movie, nobody wants a spoiler alert, okay? But in work, nobody wants to wait for War and Peace to get to the ending. So I'd open every meeting with the following. I'd say, please give me your undivided attention for the next 10 minutes as I rattle through these key points. After that, you're free to check your phone, go to the bathroom, zone out, because the next 100 pages are simply backup. So always start with the ending first. Another thing I did to address the short attention spans and not fall into the trap of the paradox of choice was being a human Google, or Hoogle, as I call it. So what I would do is I would ingest everything I could on a subject for a project, for an investment, for a deal, and then I'd morph into a walking Cliff Notes, Blinkist, Get abstract. I'd essentially help my boss or my clients more easily understand a topic by providing a well thought out, succinct summary. Then I'd give my 2 cents on the answer or the meaning to extract from the data or research, even when I was junior and even when my boss didn't necessarily ask me for my take on it. But in effect, I'd help my boss extract the signal from the noise. One added benefit was that oftentimes my work was being used by my boss in a meeting with their boss or with a client. So by giving my boss the salient points, I saved them time and made them look smarter in front of their stakeholders. I made them look good. And I found this to be the single best way for a junior professional to turn from a pigeon into a stork. Now, sidebar, if you don't do this and you make your boss try to figure out the answer from a bunch of materials or presentations or analyses that you prepared, then you might actually be in a worse position. Because if you make them figure out the answer, particularly for something that you should know, then you're actually making them do your job. And nothing makes a boss think you're more disposable than forcing your boss to do your job. So remember when I was talking about prospect theory, this is where human beings are found to be generally more risk averse. Well, that factored into how my boss thought of me as a junior person and how I interacted with my boss. So since human beings are all fundamentally risk averse, I'd always make sure that I came across as a safe pair of hands. So to use a metaphor, I'd be like 7-Eleven. When it's 2 a.m. and you run out of milk, where do you go? Who do you call? You call Dave because he's reliable. He's going to get it done. So how did I do this? Well, first off, and it's the small things that matter. When my boss called me, I pick up right away. But if I wasn't available, my recorded message would essentially ask for a detailed message back and say something like, you reached Dave Liu's voicemail. I'm not available, but please leave me a detailed message on what you need from me or what project needs to get completed or et cetera, et cetera. And so by getting that really detailed voicemail, by the time I got back to them, I'd already have a plan of attack. So I'd be able to call my boss saying, got your voicemail. Here's how I think we're going to prosecute this issue or this project that you need me to do. And 9 times out of 10, my boss would just respond and say, great, sounds good. Second, I'd always respond to emails within minutes or the hour at the latest. And if you think that's not possible, just ask yourself, how often do you look at your social media on your phone? I think most of us are frankly tethered to our phones at this point. Third, I triple check my work. I was actually known for this thing they call the Liu triple check at Jefferies, but I always believed that the small things matter. If you go to a restaurant and the silverware is dirty, what do you think? Or when you buy a product and the instruction manual is in complete broken English, does that make you question the overall product or experience? Of course it does. And it's the same with work. If your boss sees a bunch of typos or numbers that don't fit, the first thing they're going to ask themselves is like, what else could be screwed up here? So I'd always focus on the small details because, again, people are risk averse. So many young, ambitious people I know are in a rush to get up the corporate ladder. And what they fail to realize is that what their boss really wants is for the direct reports to cover the bases first, the table stakes. Only then can you aspire for more beyond that level. If you try too soon and you don't have the bases covered, then you lose credibility with your boss. Because after all, why should your boss trust you to do their job one day when you can't even do your job? Finally, on the topic of self-interest, I would always assume that my bosses were really only interested in themselves. And if they weren't, then I just consider that a happy surprise. So I would figure out what motivates my boss. Remember, every boss wants someone to do their job, but not want their job. So what would I do? I'd focus on how do I help them, my boss, rise the ladder? How could I make them look better in meetings or to their boss's boss? I wouldn't make the same mistake that I made at Goldman Sachs eons ago. I'd also let them take over credit for all my work, make sure that, they could tell their boss about how great a job they did training me, mentoring me, managing me. But lest you think I'm a fool, I'd always make sure I documented everything that I did for future reference. I document all the good interactions. Even when I was junior, if I worked on a deal, I'd ask the CEO client to send me an email on how they thought I did with the job. Again, assuming I did a good job. I'd also ask them to sometimes send a note to my boss and CC me. And so this was also that one day when I needed to fight for myself, for compensation or for promotion, I'd have a dossier ready of all of my achievements. But until then, I'd focus on helping my boss get ahead because wherever they went, as long as I pledged loyalty to them and they did a good job, they'd take me with them. I get to ride on their invisible jet or hitch myself to their cape. So here's a summary of how to be a stork and not a pigeon, how to always add value. 1, keep it short and sweet, no war and peace. 2, give your boss the answer. Don't make them do your job. 3, be a safe pair of hands. Cover the basics well. And then make your boss look good and ride their coattails. And one last thing, remember that the corporate game is a game. And what is the best way to get better at a game? Practice. practice, practice. And if you keep improving, one day you'll become a stork. So as I mentioned earlier, I wrote a career book called The Way of the Wall Street Warrior, Conquer the Corporate Game Using Tips, Tricks, and Smart Cuts. In the book, I summarize all the tactics I use to scale the corporate ladder. These tactics apply in any competitive industry, so not just Wall Street. I actually wrote the book initially for my two boys, and I wanted to make sure I could cover whatever industry they went to. I donated a bunch of copies to AIM, so you can talk to the team there and figure out how you get a copy. So far, the book has been really well received. I sold 10,000 copies in the first 2 weeks, and the book is currently top 10 bestseller on Amazon in the business finance section. It also won the Porchlight Books November Bestseller Award and is currently the #1 hot new release on Amazon in business finance and in economics. I've been giving speeches around the country, particularly at elite universities like Harvard, UPenn, UC Berkeley, primarily to Asian Americans who are, obviously just starting off in their career. And it's really resonating. The message is resonating. They all hear about the bamboo ceiling, but there's really not a lot out there in terms of how do I tactically break the bamboo ceiling. And so my book is really one of the first books that really addresses this. How do I actually crack through the ceiling with tactical advice? All the net proceeds to me, I'm donating to charity. So if you get a copy of the book and you like it, would appreciate, you tweet about it, write a good review on Amazon, and encourage, frankly, anyone else, any other Asian Americans who feel disadvantaged in any way to get a copy. This will overall, I think, help the overall community. So thanks for listening, and I hope you got at least one good tactic today that you can turn into practice at your work. Feel free to connect with me on social media, go to my website. And with that, I'll open up for questions.
So thank you so much, David, for all the great advice and really giving back to with your experience in terms of sharing it in this book and also with us this afternoon. So everyone definitely type in questions in the chat. We have one already, so I'm going to start with that one. So the question is actually, did you actually have to use your dossier that you mentioned? And did you actually have to fight for yourself, or you were lucky enough to not to?
So I would say that I had to fight for myself every day of every hour in my 25-year career there. The reality with the investment and Wall Street industry, investment management, investment banking, is that the stakes grow exponentially higher as you go up the ladder. The compensation grows exponentially, the titles grow exponentially, the power grows exponentially. And so nobody's going to do you any favors. They're literally going to pay you the least amount possible to still keep you in the seat. And I learned that the hard way in my career. So I had to fight every day of every hour. I had to use elements of my dossier all the time, because what I found also that's very common on Wall Street, and frankly, any industry, Silicon Valley is the same, where there's a team approach to something, is that success has many mothers and fathers, and a lot of them are not legitimate parents. They claim credit for things all the time. So there were people that were claiming credit on deals that I sourced, deals I executed. And if you ask the CEO to pick out that MD in a lineup, they couldn't even tell who they were. And so having this dossier, this file of every achievement I ever made was critical. And it's really shocking to me how few people actually do this. I had massive files, email files on, letters from clients. I had, and this was, obviously the internet started, a couple of years into my career. But even when we didn't have the internet, I still kept all the papers. But one of the things that was really critical was to demonstrate that I had using a police term, like the chain of custody of the sourcing of an idea or a client. So I could actually show people, this deal actually came from me and the relationship I built over 7 years, not because this other guy or this other gal just kind of parachuted in and claimed credit. And so showing that chain of custody was really critical in terms of getting credit and full credit, and frankly, also showing value to the organization. Because the perverse thing is that putting politics aside and putting aside all the human element of companies actually do want the truth. They want to keep people that bring value, and they want to eject people that don't. But the problem is we have all these people involved, and not everybody provides the value. not everybody gets compensated. And a lot of people actually want to get overcompensated for the value they bring. And the only way to get overcompensated for the value they bring is stealing credit from other people. So simple answer is, yeah, I totally have to use my dossier. And I think every single person here should be building their dossier, going back in time and also building their dossier, because that dossier becomes like your testimonials, your hard evidence, if you will, for your career and also your brand and your reputation. And so make sure that you're constantly building that, because it'll bear dividends, if not at your company, it'll bear dividends at other companies.
So I'm moving to another question. Actually, this is from my co-chair of the Asian ERG at Hancock, Donna Wong. It's a great question, because these day and age, under COVID, we always talk about work-life balance. So you mentioned about kind of working, being 7-Eleven or 24, working really 24/7. How do you balance all that and not get burnout?
Yeah, so this may be an unpopular answer, and this is my view. I don't believe in work-life balance. I actually don't think it exists. I've had the privilege of working with really successful people for a lot of my career, and a lot of them have done really well, and many of them have become billionaires. I don't know a single one that actually has work-life balance. What I do know, and is what I have, is all of them, including myself, have work-life trade-off. And what I decided in my life was that I would over-index on work in my 20s and 30s. I had a very specific goal, which was I wanted to be able to walk away at the age of 40. And 40 was a nice number. When I hit 40, I would have been at the firm for 20 years. It's probably, genetically, it's probably like the latest we could have had, second child or a child, right? And it's kind of like the midway point for a lot of people's lives, right? So mentally, I was thinking, okay, if I slave away until I'm 40, then I have a second half of my life still to do whatever I want, right? So for the first 20 years of my career, I averaged about 100 hours a week. I worked 120 before business school, and then I hovered between 80 to 100 after business school for another, 15, 16 years. And I lived on an airplane. I flew 5 million miles, actual miles, before the age of 40, and I was never home. And I was really lucky, honestly, because I married a woman who was a consultant, investment banker, venture capitalist, and a hedge fund investor. So she totally understood the world I was from, and she had a very similar career. She was like, "Look, I'm going all in on investing and building my career up until the age of 40." And then at the age of 40, that was actually when we had our second child. We both pulled the ripcord at the same time. Now, for me, Jeffries, for those of you who might be familiar with the firm, I mean, it's a tough firm, and I like to joke that it's a little bit like the mafia, right? And you don't leave the mafia leaves you. So even though I told my boss that I wanted to leave when I turned 40, it took another 3 years for me to extract myself from the firm. But during that time, I was definitely downcycling, and I was spending a lot less time, flying around the world and working 100 hours a week. And they actually gave me the leeway to start my own companies and do other things. But I think it's really, really hard. I think the friends of mine who do have a much more balanced work life, some of them are constantly lamenting the trade-offs they're making. And there's a lot of coulda, shoulda, woulda, imagine how senior I would be if I didn't have a family, or I didn't have these obligations, or my spouse was willing to stay at home, and look, I get it. Like, unfortunately, time is a zero-sum game, and I don't know any other way to do this. And I've seen a lot of people that are quite successful. They do kind of what I did. They go all in, put everything they got, like in their younger years, and with the hope and the promise that maybe when they get older, they can start to shift more to a more family, more life balance.
So we got another question that just came in. So what skill do you think helped your career the most?
Oh, it's by far it's relationship building and effectively with that salesmanship. And what I would tell you is I was freaking terrible at it. So when I was younger, I was your typical Asian American geek. So I was super good at numbers. I was I triple checked everything. I could spot a typo from a mile away. Okay, but I was on a one-way trip to staying in an office dungeon. Like there was no way that I would ever make it past, VP, maybe be a pretty good associate, kind of mid-level, but no way VP, right? And I saw the writing on the wall. And so what I did was I started to practice all these other skills that I knew I didn't have. Like, and there's a lot of things I can go into, and I actually go into a lot of this in gory detail in my book, but I would say that the main thing that I did, which worked really well, was I would go with my boss, usually MD or SVP or VP. I would go with them on pitches, around the country or meet companies. And what I would ask them is, hey, if let's say we're going to Chicago for a day, I say, hey, can I stay over in Chicago one more day? Because there's a bunch of prospects there, VCs, hedge funds, startups, right? Other companies. I'd like to go meet with them. And don't worry, man, like if any of these turn into revenue, it's yours, okay? Because I'm just a junior scrub, right? And 9 times out of 10, right, these senior bankers are like, yeah, go knock yourself out, right? Like, if Dave finds water in the desert, like it's mine anyway, right? And then what I would do is I would go to these meetings and I would bring the pitch book, because bankers without pitch books are basically naked, right? I go with my pitch book and I start pitching, right? And I'll tell you, man, the first like 6 months to a year I did this, I was freaking terrible. Like I would put my nose in the book, I start paging through it, and I wasn't reading the audience. I wasn't reading the people, and they would be bored to tears. And they would go like, man, like, I got to get out of here. Like, and when you ping them later, hey, can we do a follow-up? Like you get crickets, right? They weren't interested in meeting you. And then, but what happens is that over time, you start to learn like, oh, okay, I'm starting to figure out what stories resonate with this prospect. I'm starting to realize what it takes to actually build a trusted relationship with someone. And I started to get better at it. And ultimately, I realized that building relationships was really going to be the way that I was going to ride my way to the top, because investment banks, and it's less so in the investment management business, although I would argue there's a lot of similarity.
Right.
Investment banks, the yellow brick road of money leads to essentially clients, and clients generally do business with people that they like. They do business with people that they have a relationship with. So what you find time and time again across all of Wall Street is there's a lot of really senior people that if they're in the client-facing business, they may actually not be very good analytically, right? They're usually terrible from a detail orientation, but what they do all have in common is that they're really good at building relationships. And I view that as really a higher form of sales. So I would say if there was one thing that really helped me a lot was developing that. And the foundation of that goes back to my presentation, which is really trying to understand what motivates people. Because if you can figure out what motivates a prospect or someone that you're talking to,
Right.
you can make the conversation such that they're incented to spend time with you and they're incented to want to meet with you again.
Yep.
If you don't figure that out, then you're just wasting your time.
So we have 2 more questions. One is, how do you balance maximizing ROTI, which is the term that you introduced, versus allowing for creativity and exploring fresh ideas at work?
Yeah, so ROTI, so return on time invested, it's really hard to maximize time for creativity unless your job actually asks you to do that. Because the reality is, like, unless it's explicit, although I think it's a little insidious why they do this, but unless it's explicit in some of these tech companies, for instance, where they say, hey, spend 80% of your time on what we tell you and then 20% doing other things. Most companies don't want you to do that. So I think if that's a really important element of what you want to do, then you kind of need to seek that out in a job. Otherwise, it's hard. I will tell you though that my friends who are in the investment management business, they do have a lot more time than people in the sell side investment banking business. Yep. So I think that when you add up all the time, and I'm not trying to be critical, but when you add up all the time you watch Netflix, all the time you're surfing on Facebook or watching TikTok videos, when you start to really add that stuff up, it's actually a lot of time. And so maybe a sacrifice, the next Squid Game or the next, funny TikTok video, and you just go into a room and you paint a few paintings, right? Like you just like, explore that. I mean, that's frankly what I tried to do in kind of the second half of my life, with when I left banking. I try to, I work with a lot of companies, I make investments, but I always carve out time for me to explore other ideas, everything from like cartoons to writing to even other new business ideas. But I try to, create a little bit of a block, if you will, on my calendar. So I always have that time.
Okay, I'm cognizant of time, so just maybe take two more questions before we wrap up. And I'm sure, Dave, people can reach out to you by email if they have any follow-up. So one question: how do you decide when to switch jobs? I guess for your case, you stayed at Jefferies for pretty long duration of your career, almost the entire career. But any answer to this question?
Yeah, so I many years ago, I studied and I read this Japanese framework, the Ikigai framework, IKIGAI, and that has just been a really easy way for me to continue to iterate towards my North Star. And I'll be honest, I looked at my Ikigai framework on an annual basis, and for 25 years, it kept saying, just keep doing what you're doing. And the Ikigai framework is really very simple. It's 4 questions you ask yourself, which is, what are you passionate about, right? Kind of cliche, but like, what do you really care about? What are you good at, right? And you can kind of decide for yourself what that means, or if you're good at something or not. What does society value, right? And what will society pay for? Because what society values isn't always what they're willing to pay for. Like an example would be like teachers, right? Teachers were highly valued by society, but we don't really pay them what they're valued, right? So those are 4 questions. And if you think of them as like concentric circles, where they overlap is really the area that you want to achieve and find through the course of your life. Right? Because if you find something that you're passionate about, that you're good at, the society values and society pays for, that's a magical place to be. So for me, I would always constantly revisit that. And earlier in my career, I'll be honest, like I wasn't passionate about like doing spreadsheets and PowerPoints and, frankly, even learning about business. But I was at poverty. I was dirt poor. I needed to pay off my school debt, and I needed to, be able to send money home. And so in my kind of Ikigai framework, right, I'd say passion was the lowest, but I was good at it. Society values it, and society paid for it, right? So I'm like, okay, if it's a table, 3 of the legs of the table are enough to hold it up. It's not very stable, but they'll hold it up. And then over time, the passion side started to become stronger because I started focusing on internet and tech companies, which I really enjoyed, and I really love learning. Web 1.0, Web 2.0, they were all really interesting periods of time. So my table started to get a little more stable, right? But then over time, my passion really shifted more towards my family and, entrepreneurship. I always wondered, I was always the bridesmaid, but never the bride, could actually be an entrepreneur. So the passion thing kind of shifted to something else. And that was when I decided, my Ikigai framework is a little out of whack, right? And I've already saved enough money, I can walk away from this thing. Now's kind of the time to kind of walk away. So I think and I counsel people this all the time, think about those questions, the answer to those questions for you, and don't park it forever. Like, revisit it. I actually think revisiting on an annual basis is pretty good. Like, ask yourself at the end of every year when you get that bonus check, right? Okay, do I still really like what I'm doing? Am I good at it? Right? Because I think it's important to be good at something, because if you're not good at it, then it becomes like a vicious circle and you start to feel like, well, I'm not really good at this, right? And nobody really wants to pay me for it. Does society value, and does society still pay for whatever your job is? And if the answer, if it's ever kind of out of whack in a big way, that's when I think you start considering changing career or changing jobs.